Cool. I am like, dude, this is crazy. I've got all the best people in the house right now. Welcome to the panel, Why Scholarship on BIPOC Comics Matters. I'm Frederick Luis Aldama, otherwise known as Professor Latinx or Latinx. I teach at The Ohio State University. I'm the author of a bunch of books. My scholarship has tended to focus on Latinx pop culture, including especially comics. I published a kid's book called The Adventures of Chupacabra Charlie with a comics illustrator, and just put into production with Papa another comics book illustrator, Nikki Rodriguez, and I did that, and completing a sci-fi comic called Labyrinths Born. I am incredibly honored to have this talented group of Latinx scholars with me today to discuss why scholarship on BIPOC Comics Matters as part of the BCAF 2021 panel series. Dr. Teresa Rojas, PhD from The Ohio State University, Associate Professor at Modesto Junior College, author of numerous articles, artist, illustrator, and founding director of the Latinx Comics Art Festival. And you can find her work at www.teresarojas.com. Dr. Jorge Santos, PhD from the University of Connecticut, Associate Professor at the College of the Holy Cross, award-winning author of graphic memories of the Civil Rights Movement. And for some sort of crazy, amazing reason, he's not to be found on social media, at least that I know of. But you can find him at the English department at the College of the Holy Cross. Dr. Enrique Garcia, PhD from UMass Amherst, Associate Professor and Chair of Luso-Hispanic Studies at Middlebury College, award-winning author of numerous books, including The Hernandez Brothers, Love Rockets, and Alternative Comics. You can find Enrique on social media and, of course, at Middlebury College. Welcome all of you. So yeah, it's here we are, we're doing this thing, we're doing our scholarship, and I want to just lead or ask with the question, what the heck, how did you guys get into researching, publishing on comics, and specifically BIPOC comics? Teresa, do you want to kind of launch us here?
Sure. So I was very fortunate to work with just a fantastic group of folks over at the Ohio State University when I was a graduate scholar there. And it was Dr. David Herman, my first advisor, who I'd go into his office, and ramble about the things that I wanted to work on. And I was really interested in bringing together and working intersectionally with feminism, visual culture, autobiography, literature, among other things. And the first thing he did was hand me Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. And I remember thinking, why are you handing me comics, man? I'm a grad student, I'm a big girl now. Why are you handing this to me? But it became a gateway for me, because not only was he right, it was bringing together all of these different genres, these different elements of study, but on a whole other level of just a way of cognitively approaching literature. And that was the first. And then it was our own Dr. Frederick Luis Aldama, who invited me to attend the Latino Comics Expo. I think it was back in 2011, I want to say. And that was my first one. I had heard of it before that, but I hadn't had a chance to go, and went to that one and got to meet so many just outstanding creators. And I presented some work on autobiographical comics. I got to meet folks from not just all over the country, but there were attendees from around the world there, many of whom I'm still good friends with. And that was revelatory for me. And that started my whole dissertation project on this different imaginaries, different ways of thinking about, writing about, and sharing the work of, in my case, Latinx creators. And that was really the beginning.
Thank you, Teresa. Dr. J, what's your story?
What's my story? So I guess I grew up reading comics. You know, I don't know if you can see all my accoutrement. I grew up reading comics. My parents were immigrants, and I learned reading picture books and then novels and then comics. And I think sort of to go back to what Teresa said, I graduated to novels and then like poetry. But I kept reading all my favorite comics and mangas the whole time. Like I never stopped. I just sort of thought of them as distinct. But I was always drawn to characters that either were like either racial allegories, like the X-Men were my immediate favorite, and or what I call sort of like, to at least to the eyes of a young reader, non-racial meaning. So I love Spider-Man because, as you know, anybody can be Spider-Man, right? You can't tell his racial identity when he's in costume. And the Ninja Turtles, because they are sort of, you find out later, obviously ethnically inflected, but when you're at 12, you're like, oh, anybody can be a Ninja Turtle. They're just green and have a mask, right? And then as I started working towards my dissertation and stuff, I wanted to include a section on a graphic novel called Pablo's Inferno. I know you know it well. Shouts to Rody, great guy. Although actually, since I've mentioned his name, he still hasn't put out the colored version of Pablo's Inferno, so I just want to throw shade at him while we're here. So he knows I haven't forgotten, because he keeps promising me he'll do it and he never does it. And it fell out of my dissertation, so it just became my first article. But then I could have had this sort of, I guess I'll call it an epiphany, I guess, like you can study comics. Like I didn't realize I could be doing this whole time. And I had some great mentors at UConn, Kathy and Martha, shout outs to them. They encouraged me. And eventually I started, doing the conference circuit, where I met a mutual friend, Chris Gonzalez, who then, through him, I met Fred, and then they both basically just said, forget your dissertation, just do comics from now on, which when you're sort of trying to get tenure, you're like, that doesn't sound like a gamble I should make, but I did it, and it worked out, and here I am now teaching comics and studying comics. And in regards to sort of the original question about, the BIPOC approach to all this, what I love about comics as a field is, one, that it's genuinely interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, right? Anything from cognitive approaches to classic literary approaches to art history approaches, right? But I would also say, despite touching all those fields, it isn't saddled with the history of those fields in quite the same way, particularly in the sense that there is as opposed to, say, for me coming from literature, it always feels like I'm trying to carve out space in an existing canon that doesn't want to yield any ground. But with comics, in terms of scholarship, but also in terms of the comics themselves, it feels like those canons are emerging now, and we can get in on the ground floor and have a say, and have, the priorities and the work of BIPOC creators and scholars be foundational to the founding of a field, as opposed to an addendum that comes later that can feel tokenized or sidebar. So for me, the excitement of a field that feels new, like all the major scholars in the field I've met, right, is exciting to me. And I think the possibilities for a truly representational field are exciting. And I don't say that in a naive way. I understand there's always going to be challenges no matter where you are, but I think the possibilities are really exciting.
Enrique.
Well, hi. I am from Puerto Rico, so I was raised in the island, and I came to the U.S. when I came to do my PhD. So what was interesting in my case was when I was growing up in the 80s in Puerto Rico, we would have access to Latin American comics and also American comics. So you could get the Marvel, DC stuff in the comic book stores, but then you will get all the Mexican comic books in the newsstand. So therefore I was reading Calimán, Memín, all these Mexican comics at the same time of Spider-Man and Batman, etc. At some point, the Mexican industry kind of died, so then the Puerto Rican industry became mostly uh, people were mostly buying American comic books in the 90s. But then I think because my degree is in comparative literature, part of my research was more about integrating how the English narratives compare with a lot of the Spanish narratives. And so when I was, one of my first articles as a, in grad school was about comparing Memín Penguin with Bonnie White from The Spirit, and then how both characters works as minstrel characters, kind of like from a Mexican and American perspective, and how they're different and similar at the same time. So interestingly, I kind of like began integrating more my research about how the Latinx comics are compared to Latin America. So I would say that that's my main thing in my research and in the way I teach, which is that sometimes there are like some things that are similar, that could be politically similar. Sometimes they're politically different. Sometimes they're aesthetically similar. And one of the things that I have been trying to integrate more recently is, for example, the influence of Japanese comics in Latinx and Latin American culture, because sometimes I feel that Hispanic culture has this very idea that, oh, we have only indigenous Black and Hispanic influences, but you can see the Japanese influence aesthetically and all over the place. So again, I would say that maybe because I studied in that way in comparative, I have been trying to, let's say, break out the linguistic borders that sometimes people try to establish in academia. And to me, that was very weird, because sometimes when I was in grad school, the Spanish departments wanted Spanish comics, and then the English department wanted English comics, and they didn't see that there was like a convergence. And so to me, then now, even though I'm in a Spanish department, also Hispanic studies, my classes are bilingual, and they include both American, Latin American, and Spanish comics, and they are in English and Spanish at the same time. So hopefully, that's what I can contribute in the future.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you guys have shared your journeys. The mostly what I'm hearing is super like triumphal, positive kind of stories. But I know that, and Enrique, you're gesturing toward that in your response, but definitely there continue to be challenges. And maybe, Enrique, you were talking about challenges of discipline, but challenges also of language, challenges of a kind of almost, maybe could we even say narcissism, certainly a myopic approach where the US and English is a kind of dominant. But what other kinds of challenges? Dr. J, maybe you can launch us with that.
Challenges, I mean, I think there's the dual problems of legitimacy and territory. I think legitimacy itself is a kind of double-edged sword, right? Because comics as a medium, regardless of the BIPOC angle, have struggled to gain legitimacy, even sort of in the minds, probably even in our own minds. Like Teresa, you had a very interesting story about the sort of implicit bias we have against comics. Like, why are you handing me a comic book? This is for kids, right? And then of course we learn, oh, I was wrong. This is a rich field, right? I had it. Like, I've been reading comics since I was 9, 10, and I never once occurred to me to treat them as academic study, right? Until somebody else had the same moment as you, Teresa. And I think that when you're taking the BIPOC approach, you're always struggling with issues of legitimacy, right? I'm in a literature department, and I think that it's fair to say that while this is a issue of degrees, depending on where you're at, it is infrequent that a BIPOC approach or priorities are central to the project of that major or that degree climb, right? So we have this sort of double problem of legitimacy where you're working on both a marginalized art form from a marginalized perspective, right? I also think that same issue generates tremendous amounts of creativity because the marginal funds, they all fund themselves on these fringes and create an amazing piece of artwork, which we're all now sort of unearthing. But I think that's the sort of challenge, though. I mean, it's easy for us to believe in this because we know the truth about it, but it's another thing entirely to convince the status quo that something that has been sidelined should be centered. And then is the question of territory, right? Comics, because of their interdisciplinary nature, belong to everyone and no one at the same time. But I think that as comics gain more and more ground culturally, academically, and in regard to the market, there's going to be a territorialization of comics, right? Who gets to talk about comics, right? Is it going to belong to art history? English right now is probably the leading contender. Or will it break off and become its own thing, as is attempted in certain places? And then if it does, what will that look like? Is it just going to be an existing humanities department by a different name, or will it be actually something different? So I think those are the two biggest challenges that will be coming up, because as many talented scholars there are of comics in the country, none of their I guess pedagogical work, except with some exceptions, is probably not focused on comics, right? See, comics are still the thing I study most and the things I teach the least, right? So I think those would be the two things I see on the horizon.
Teresa, Dr. Rojas.
Yeah, so for me, it was, I guess it still is, initially convincing my students of why are we studying these works, right? What is it that we're getting out of it? And it's really just a matter of not realizing the possibilities. When I first started here in Modesto, I was doing more conventional works with a unit on comics at the end. And then I started to realize that's where, even though that's where the lowest energy is happening for the end of the semester, that's where I was getting the most excitement, particularly when I started having my students drawing so that they could get a sense of the labor of comics, which I think is important. Drawing, and then also, I always refer to them as scholars. My college is almost 60% Latinx. And this is important for them to realize that not only are they scholars, but they're artists, they're scientists, they're all these different things, and they're not yet accustomed. They haven't been professionalized yet, if we can call it that, to think of themselves in that way. So by bringing these texts in, these BIPOC texts make a huge difference, not only because they're reflective of themselves, but because it helps them see themselves as creators, as scholars. And so I've shifted now in certain courses where it makes sense to do so. I only teach comic texts, and they're so rich. I can spend so much time on them, and we can really get into these different elements of visual culture, you know, how to read an image, not just reading the text, right? So you can't do that. As much as I still love novels, of course I still read. Short stories are fantastic, but getting into that, reading images and what these images represent, when you have images of people of color, when you have sexualities represented, then all of a sudden you see, or I see, my students not only identifying, but wanting to create their own work. That's the most exciting thing for me, because we might start out where they're like, look, I'm not an artist, I don't draw, I can only do stick figures. I get excited by stick figures, let's do this, right? Because comics are so representational. And so that's a big thing. And then the other challenge, I think initially, that I don't run into as frequently, but it was as the director of the Latinx Comic Arts Festival, when I brought the first comics event to Modesto, which was actually the Latino Comics Expo, I co-directed that. So I invited my friends Javier Hernandez and Ricardo Padilla up here. There was sort of questions about how are we going to make this a relevant event? You know, it sounds like fun, let's do some comics. And then when we actually did it, it was the most highly attended Latino event in the history of the college.
All right.
And all of a sudden, yes, snaps all the way, man. It was amazing. And then all of a sudden I had people emailing me saying, oh, I had no idea. I had no idea. And part of that is that the creators who attended, folks I've become friends with, people who the creators didn't realize how hungry Modesto was. I don't think Modesto realized how hungry Modesto was for this kind of work. And so it was a chance for the creators to talk about their work. Of course, we had panels and workshops, but that room full of brown faces, was electric. And it was just such a satisfying experience. I still have my colleagues who say, oh, I remember that. When, of course, when are we going to do it again is a big question. We're doing it virtually this year, hopefully next year. But just getting that buy-in initially is always a challenge. But I feel like I'm here in my little alcove. I'm in a great place right now because I don't get a lot of questioning of why. It's more now when, how much more can you do? And I'm like, I still have to teach a full load, man. So I can only do so much, right? So those are some of the major things. But for me, and this goes back to what Jorge was saying, this is all good work. This is some good challenges because it elevates how we're approaching our work, how we're thinking about things. And for me, it helps me, not only it introduces me to so much new work. I had no idea how much is out there. And as much as I was introduced to tons of work, there's so much more that I haven't been introduced to, and that I see myself as a guide for others. Oh, you haven't read, have you heard of this person? Have you heard of, Nikki Rodriguez's work? Well, let me introduce you, right? Have you heard of Crystal Gonzalez? Oh, well, let me introduce you. So, yeah.
Enrique, you earlier mentioned that sort of the challenge of real interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity. But I want to ask another question which presents its own sets of challenges that I think Jorge will also be able to respond to. And it piggybacks off of what Dr. Rojas mentioned in terms of Modesto and it being a predominantly Latinx community. So Enrique, you are in a very sort of elite white institution and you're teaching, Latinx comics, BIPOC comics. Not to mention, of course, the languages that you're speaking and teaching across. But what are some of the challenges and maybe even some of the joys that you've encountered from kind of overcoming those challenges in that space of Middlebury College?
Well, the interesting thing is, and this is where academic space plays a role too, because that affects the dynamics of what is it that you teach. Because I'm in a Spanish department, so it's not the same as American studies or in the English department, where. So one of the issues that I had at first, I go to a Spanish department with classes taught in Spanish, and therefore I'm assuming I'm teaching a survey class of Latin American comics, that covers everything from the Latinx comics all the way down to Argentina, etc. The issue I had first was that in the process of decolonizing the aesthetic, I realized that a lot of the students didn't have even the background on the colonizing aesthetics. So when you ask the first day of class, what comics have you read? Some of them will say Garfield comics, newspaper strips, like they wouldn't have read like a comic, a graphic novel, etc. So therefore I have planned my curriculum only with texts that are Latinx and Spanish where they're criticizing, but they haven't seen or read the original stuff that was imperialist or racist, or so it was difficult to establish that deconstruction just on the pure POC text because they didn't have the background that we have because, you know, I was raised on the American comics too. And so I know, oh, when Gilbert Hernandez is parodying this, is because he read this particular 1950s DC comics or Marvel comics that were problematic in a different way. So in later versions of the class, I began to introduce some of the racist or imperial comics just so that they see what is it that the Latinx and the Latin Americans are reacting to. Another mistake that I think I did was that when I taught my first year seminar, you know, the writing classes for first year, I was like, okay, I'm not going to be just limited to the Latin American space because I have all this knowledge. So I'm going to create a Batman class in English, which I thought was a cool idea. But then I realized that because I was only teaching the white narratives, even though I was deconstructing everything in the class, it was only me who was providing the POC perspective because I hadn't put POC comments in the process. So therefore you could see that some of the students kind of like were like, oh, the professor is complaining about this because he's POC, as opposed to there is a narrative that is reacting to this idea of, you know, Eurocentrism, white supremacy, etc. So then in the third version of a comic class that I have done, which is what I mentioned earlier, I made them more bicultural, bilingual, where you can see the hegemonic comics, you can see the Latin American and Latinx comics that are reacting to that hegemonic comic. And I even introduced 1 week of classes where we see white people reacting to the hegemonic white narrative so that they see that the white creators can also, you know, deconstruct what is happening. It's not just the POC because sometimes they assume, oh, the role of the POC creator is just to go against the system, but you know, the white creators can do it too. So anyway, I'm trying to create a more bilingual space that where they can see that everything is connected in a way. But like I said, it's an evolution that I had to teach 3 different classes to kind of come up, like to get that balance in a way.
Yeah. That said, I mean, it's amazing. It's so cool that you've had the opportunity to have 3 different iterations, right? So that's a big celebration, and I know it didn't come easy either, Enrique. But Jorge, yeah, I know you want to throw down here too.
Yeah, so it was a similar place as Enrique, an elite liberal arts school. Because of the Catholic connection, I suspect, maybe I'm wrong though, that definitely, maybe I'll rephrase it this way. There are more Latinx students than I expected. And I think the Catholic connection is a big one, particularly that and the Jesuit connection, I think are big. Now they're still like very small chunk of the students, but I was expecting almost nobody, if I'm being honest. But so let me answer the question in 2 ways. So most of all, mostly I teach comics in lit courses. It's maybe once a year I get to teach a class that's exclusively on comics or visual narrative, but typically it's going to be spliced into an existing course. So when I teach in an American literature, in my survey, I teach Mouse because it's, I think, an important American genre, right? And I think for many of them, I sort of see 2 experiences. There are more and more students coming in already excited about comics, either because of the Marvel movies or because, and this is something going back to what Enrique said earlier, with Latinx students in particular, many of them are manga fans, right? Japanese culture. I say that, I realize as I say that I'm actually wearing a Dragon Ball Z t-shirt. So, you know, it's the same. So they have that manga connection already. So they're interested in the sort of American side of a tradition that they already know from this international. And in those who have not read comics, but at this point have realized that, oh, comics are a thing, so I should know them because they're sort of beautiful students. And they get really into them because there's so many opportunities for epiphany with comics because there's so many narrative registers, and there's, for many of them, it's an unfamiliar medium, so they're sort of learning that as well. So in that sense, as a culture, the students have been very ready to accept comics. And when I do teach a class exclusively on comics, there's usually a waiting list, right? So on that angle, they're ready for it. Now, in terms of like the BIPOC angle though, One of the pieces of, and this is something maybe I'll throw out as a question because I don't know this phenomenon. I don't know if this is a problem with the canon or something else there. But when I used to teach Latin American literature, one of the most common criticisms I would get, or maybe not criticisms, pieces of feedback, is that a lot of the texts were sort of narratively, I'm going to say redundant. And then some student finally told me the truth, was like, they're all sad. Like, she was Afro-Latina. She's like, all these books are sad. And I'm like, yeah, I guess I don't feel bad being Latino. I don't know why every book on my syllabus is just like the tragedy of being Latino. And so what I did is, I got to break this up. I got to have some joy in here, some experimentation, something that's more, if not celebratory, certainly not mired into dour experience. Not that you can exclude that stuff, but that's not the whole story either. And immediately, comics solved everything, right? You want the joy of discovering your Latinx identity, throw in some Miles Morales. You want to explore the possibilities of gender and masculinity, throw in some Hernandez books. If you want to think about history in some clever way that doesn't downplay its terror, but isn't exclusively hinged on that, go Paulo's Inferno. Like, there's so much, you know? So when it came to sort of having a fuller expression of Latinidad, comics fixed it completely. Like, this is where I went to the point where I wondered, what is that? Are we just like, is the Latinx canon just sort of replicating the academic, well, not the literary sort of priority that only sad things are smart, you know? Or is it something else, you know? But that's the first thing. And then immediately those classes started humming in a way they never did before, because there's this sort of joy in it. And I think for my white students, it gives them a break from having to hear about tragedy. And for my Latinx students, it gives them a break from having to be victims, right? You can't really layer on a victim narrative to Miles Morales. It's the opposite of that, right? And I've seen that now happen in other courses. So like in my immigrant narratives class, I include Superman now. The one by Mark Waid in 2005, which I think is excellent. But the problems of being an immigrant are counterbalanced by the joy of discovering a version of yourself that would have been hidden from you, right? So it's more of a balanced approach to these experiences. I don't know maybe I'll ask you guys, I don't know why comics seem to be able to break free from the sort of literary priority of being downers. I don't know how else to put it, right? Junot Diaz very famously said, like, yeah, when you're a BIPOC writer, you have to emulate what the market thinks you should be saying to get success. So part of it might be that comics don't have the expectation that this is just going to be sad all the time, unless it's a Zack Snyder movie. And yeah, had to make my Marvel. And so I don't know. So I guess I'll leave it there. But the opportunities for having just a joyful classroom are elevated when you include comics. And I don't know what it is. Like, I don't know what it is, but I know that I don't feel bad being Latino. But if you look at my first few syllabi, you would assume that I did.
Yeah, that's awesome. You guys have my brain going all over the place. Colonizing, decolonizing aesthetics, the great kind of variety of genres that BIPOC comics, Latinx comics are working within and through. As Jorge just kind of, gave us that wonderful kind of laundry list. I'm gonna ask Teresa to kind of lead with this one, but let me ask you guys, let's push a little harder on this. And by the way, Jorge, I love the kind of redirecting to joy as well, because we can learn and we can decolonize through joy as well. Mm-hmm. But Teresa, and then the rest of you, can BIPOC comics, word-drawn storytelling, do something different or even better, if I could risk that, than other narrative forms? And I'm thinking here of the novel or short story or film, or, go over wherever you want. Yeah, I mean, I know it's a question that I think we're asked a lot, but maybe you can share your thoughts here.
Yeah, and it's rhetorical in many ways, right? Of course, the answer is yes. Yes, we can. But I think a lot of this has to do with accessibility, the accessibility of comics. So we tend to think that we need fancy things in order to create art, right? You have to have the right paint, or you have to have a fancy camera, or you have to have, a publisher for your novel. And that's just not the case. With comics, there's the challenge of combining the drawing and the text, but all you need is a pencil and paper, right? So you have the tools. You can grab a crayon, you can grab anything. And I like to do these exercises in class where we draw triangles and squares and little, filled in circles, and we create stories with the simplest thing. And then we also look at, okay, how do we deal with issues of ethnicity and race and gender when we're using representation like that? And how do we, diversify what we're creating, and what does it mean to do that? So I think that there's so much that we can do with comics, and so much that we don't even know yet. And part of the importance of scholarship is discovering that and sharing that. And the example, because I'm looking at the poster behind you, Fede, is Maddie's rocket on this poster, and how gorgeous that is. And I had Tim, when I was at MIT for a couple years, I had him come and speak to my class. I got to teach a women in comics class, and he came and did this demonstration about the development of different images in comics. And one of the exercises that he showed us, that he did, the demonstrations, is that he showed us a very simple version of a face, and then a slightly more complex version, maybe the first two most of us could draw, and then a realistic version in his third panel. And we were looking, I believe he was drawing someone from the class, and we were just looking at these different possibilities for the development of the image, right? And how we can read these, and also how culturally relevant that is. The more that you develop the image, that whatever rhetorical choices you're making, which aren't things that you really do so much in, let's say, a novel. You can describe it in a novel, but once you actually are creating the visual. I had a student in my last semester say, we do a lot of reading in these courses, but I never thought about how comics, they give you a launching point, and then you fill in a lot of the gaps, right? In the gutters, all of that stuff, but also just jumping from one image to another. They're so complex. Another text that I have taught recently is in an Intro to African American Literature. We had our comics unit at the end, and I wanted them to think about Afrofuturism from the beginning. So in the beginning, I asked them the question, what do you think about when you think of Afrofuturism? Most of them had never heard of this concept before. So I explained it a bit, and they all went to the film Black Panther. Everyone was Black Panther. So then we read Bitter Root at the end of the semester, the first collection of Bitter Root. And then talk about, how is this Afrofuturism, Harlem Renaissance, monster genre? And they were just like, where did this come from? What is this magical thing? And so you don't get that reaction with a film, because there's an expectation of the spectacular of a film, right? And a novel sort of takes your imagination into different places. But in a comic, to read a comic that's combining all of these things together and bringing African American culture together in this way, it's constantly new and exciting and interesting in ways that I just don't think other genres can compete.
Enrique.
Well, one of the interesting things, a few summers ago, I was teaching a grad class in Middlebury Summer School for Spanish teachers, for high school teachers. And it was interesting that they reacted very well to learning about comics, because usually the approach of Middlebury was to teach them literature, Don Quixote, etc. But they're teaching third graders, so they're not teaching Don Quixote to the third graders. So then they were fascinated with learning about comics, because they saw, especially using like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, like how the abstract nature of the comics help to bypass certain things about race and ethnicity, that some things are very limited in, let's say, photography with movies, etc. Which, going back to Jorge's, I think you were teaching Mouse, for example, which is a very Jewish comic book, but then at the same time with the mouses and the cats, it becomes like universal in a way, and that can only be done with comics. And to me, another example is, I don't know if you have read the Japanese comic Rose of Versailles, which is about the French Revolution. So you get the Japanese woman who does a comic about the French Revolution, and nobody's questioning that. Nobody's saying, oh, what are the Japanese doing in French narrative? But if they would do that in a movie, they would be like, oh my God, they have Japanese actors playing French. So suddenly the abstract nature of comic, I think, can help bypass some of the limitations that we have set up in how we perceive certain cultural issues. And I think that that's something fascinating to me specifically. And now that I'm doing, for example, my book about Puerto Rico and the superhero genre, Puerto Rican artists can do comic book about aliens. They can make them about white people. They can make them about Latinx characters, and nobody's saying you have to do specifically about Puerto Rican characters. So I think that the comic book world narrative gives a malleability to what you put on the page that other mediums can't.
Jorge, you've written in a way, a whole book about this, but yeah, can you tell us, like, unzip your brain on this?
Yeah. I mean, I'm like you, I'm sort of going in 3 or 4 different directions. If I can go back to Teresa's point about like drawing, all you need is a pencil and a paper. Currently, I've been researching graphic narrative depictions of the Vietnam War, right, then and now. And one thing that struck me, and to educate myself, I watched like a ton of movies from the Vietnam era, because my idea is that when we think about Vietnam, the visual language of Vietnam is a bunch of iconic films more than it is newsreel footage, even though for the films, the newsreel footage was what they were sort of working from. But there's definitely a genealogy there. But there's, I think, a series of visual tropes that come with Vietnam. And also because, 2020 wasn't harrowing enough, I figured I might as well study Vietnam, right? So, but what struck me is how many comics I discovered written by soldiers, former soldiers, and you don't see that in film, right? There's a certain level of gatekeeping that doesn't exist with comics. Even, I would even argue now there are even less because of things like Patreon and just the internet, right? There is less and less gatekeeping with comics. And I think that's part of the diversity of voice you get in comics, because it's like I said, you just need a pencil and paper, right? And you can tell your visual version of a story. So I think that is, something that we are still grappling with, because with that, I think, comes what's very interesting in terms of some of these discussions we've been having is that comics aren't saddled with the burden of tradition in the same way that other mediums have been. If for no other reason, it just maybe haven't been around as long in its contemporary form. I mean, comics as we know them, in the United States at least, I should say, because I'm an American scholar, is the 70s, right? I mean, there's of course a bunch of prehistory, but because of all the history of censorship, its evolution got cut short and then had to restart. And now we are seeing now for the first time ever a tradition forming. But even when things say like superheroes, I mean, they love rebooting themselves every 20 years. Like they love to say tradition, and in 20 years they throw it all out the window and start over. So there is something liberating about that, right? And I'm really curious to see what happens next now that we are seeing a canon forming. We're seeing people like Alan Moore telling the next generation what they should be doing and how they should be feeling, which a little part of me is like, bro, you made your contribution. Quit shaking your rake at us. But so what's going to happen now? Are we going to sort of like maintain this sort of freedom to experiment, right? Like, as you said, Japanese writers creating comics about French history, right? White writers creating comics about Latino history, right? And all these sort of like sort of this sort of cross-pollination that can happen both across identity intersectional lines, genre lines. And can we maintain that? But then how do you maintain it without turning that into a tradition, right? So we're at an interesting sort of like nexus point, I think, about what comics are going to become. And I'm really excited to be participating in that, even in my small way. But I'm very interested and excited and a little trepidatious about what's coming next.
Yeah, right.
Can we
Yeah,
say something
absolutely.
about gatekeeping? I wanted to jump off of what Jorge was just saying, because I think this is important, this idea of gatekeepers. And as someone who has come across many, many, many gatekeepers or attempts to gatekeep, because I don't really ask permission anymore, I just barrel ahead. And I'm fortunate to be in a place where I have a lot of freedom. I have more freedom than I realized when I started here, which is fantastic. But I think it's important to emphasize that, especially to younger scholars, to not ask permission, right? To create the stories, like become a creator. If that's what you want to do, become a creator, create those stories that you want to see in the world. I say this all the time. But as a scholar, study the things that you want to study. And if it's BIPOC comics, then do BIPOC comics. When I was a graduate scholar, I was trying to do scholarship initially that I thought would get me to wherever it was I was trying to get a job, of course, that sort of thing. Things that I was hearing, oh, you should study, this, that, and the other. And it was professors at Ohio State, including Dr. Aldama, who were like, is this really what you want to do? So I said, not really, but this is what I think I should be doing. And that was sort of the beginning of the breaking up of the gatekeeping, to say, first of all, there aren't enough of us, right? There aren't enough of us studying this. And second, stop asking permission. Study what you want to study because it's worthy of study. These texts are worthy of study. They are complex, they're compelling, they're innovative. Just the innovation in this area is overwhelming at times. And so I just wanted to mention that I try to train my students to just do it, kind of do the work and then ask for forgiveness later, right? Don't ask for permission in the beginning. Because I think sometimes what this leads to is innovative work. Our own work becomes innovative because we just did it.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let me just say something too. The elasticity is what you guys are telling us. Like, it's not even a fear of something to come. We've already seen, in a way, comic studies get the cement kind of hardening around Satrapi and Spiegelman and Bechdel. And it's like, hold on, no. Like, we do BIPOC scholarship precisely to keep the field elastic and vital and alive, because those aren't the only three that should be taught, in a survey course, et cetera, right? Let me, because we're coming kind of to the end of the time. Jorge, I know you were bursting to say something, and then let me move us to this final question, if that's okay. Yeah. Okay. So yeah.
I can talk, man. You know that.
I know. Me too. All of us. What's next? So Enrique, I know you guys are all working on stuff, and in fact, Dr. Rojas has just recently announced the Latinx Comics Arts Fest 2021, but other things that you're doing. Enrique, I know you're working on a book, Jorge, but Enrique, why don't you take us sort of, pedal us to the end here with, you starting us off. Yeah, gotta unmute yourself there. Yep.
Again, what's the question?
Yeah, what are you working on, man? What's your project? I know you're deep into a project right now.
Yeah, well, I'm doing it's a book about the role of Puerto Rico in the American superhero genre. And so practically what I'm exploring is how the Latinx Puerto Ricans have a different experience to the Puerto Rican in the island. So it's like you get Puerto Rican comics that are created in different ways, but at the same time, they share a connection because they do superheroes. And then how this deals with the colonization of Puerto Rico by the American government. And then how those experiences are different and similar at the same time, and the politics are similar and different at the same time. And so, I mean, it's an interesting project. Also, one of the challenges is to balance the super mainstream Puerto Rican work in the superhero genre, like for example, George Perez in the Wonder Woman, New Titans, Infinity Gauntlet, with the more underground comics that are interesting because they have, like certain political inclinations that are decolonizing, but then they don't get the same press because they're not in Marvel and DC. So these last 2 years, I have been kind of like trying to integrate that. So it's kind of like a post-colonial book in a way. It's kind of like about how the Puerto Rican artists in booths, places are trying to decolonize. And then I would say the latter part of the book is about gender, because now we get more women, more LGBTQ creators, and then how that affects the politics, because it's not the same when it kind of like it's like a post-colonial heteronormative scene from the 1980s as opposed to now, which has like a different vibe in the sense of, how they're portraying a lot of these political elements. One of the things also that I find interesting is about how the Puerto Rican Latinx are part of a more radical culture in the US rather than the culture in the island, because the culture in the island is oppressed by the government. So there is a government that is enforcing a colonial culture, while the Puerto Ricans in the US, even though they are in the main body of the US, they have more contact with African Americans and the Latinx and the Chicano. So therefore they are part of a more subversive political culture than the people in the island, which I thought that was fascinating in a way. And it's reflected in the superhero comics per se.
Wow, I can't wait. And Jorge, what are you working on?
As I mentioned, I'm working on a book about Vietnam. It's kind of a follow-up to Graphic Memories, which is about the civil rights movement. And you said something great earlier about study what you want to study it the way you want to study it, and express your thoughts the way you want to express them. Actually, it's been both fun and daunting project because I am trying to write it in a way that embraces my subjectivity, right? But in a way that doesn't become about me, so it's a delicate balance. But one of the things that really sort of like has been bouncing around in my head, and I gotta write it out and put it in this book, I'm probably gonna open with it, is the fact that my family didn't come to the United States until the 1980s, and we have some undocumented in my history, without outing anybody, And coming in the 1980s, and I've always had this sort of direct relationship with American history because this is ostensibly my history. I was born here, right? It's like an inheritance in a sense, but it's also like you can't even trace my family back to any of these moments. We just got here, But on the other, so it sometimes feels like mine, but not mine, right? But then on the other hand, Vietnam in particular produces the Refugee Act that created the asylum policies that allowed my family to stay. Because we're Salvadorian, we're running from an American-led, I don't know how else to call it, I guess, but certain, an intervention in somebody else's, political process that resulted in a bloody civil war, right? So it's very much like Vietnam. So in some ways, the Vietnam War has very directly shaped my life and my history. So trying to grapple with that in the context of an academic project that talks about how comics becomes these sort of visual representations of cultural memory has taken a personal turn for me. So I'm working on how to write personally and academically when those two things have been separated from each other for so long, because we sort of have this tendency to, you know, embrace subjectivities in the classrooms, but when we write, we sort of hide our subjectivity, right? Because we're sort of used to this third person distancing. And I want to try to figure out a way to collapse those without just turning into a sort of like subjective set of personal readings, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. But it's an exciting challenge to resolve.
Again, you know, thank goodness you guys are out there doing this stuff, man, because it's like the real pulse of comic studies is you guys are it. But Teresa, tell us about what you're up to.
Yeah, my head is still dwelling on Jorge's project. It sounds just fantastic, and I look forward to talking to you more about it. So I have the festival coming up. It's the virtual version of the Latinx Comic Arts Festival. That's March 12th and 13th. We will have panels and workshops, and then we have another surprise coming together. And so I'm not going to announce it, because if it doesn't come together, then surprise, that won't happen. So, but it'll be really cool, and I think it'll be fine. And then I'm also in the process of putting together a dream anthology for me. I'm getting art right now, and that is Latinx stories of illness, trauma, and healing. Graphic medicine is one of my specialties. I'm on the executive board of the Graphic Medicine International Collective. And the stories that are coming in are just, I don't even know what to say about them. And you know, there's some sad ones, and then there's really uplifting, beautiful, beautiful all around. And as part of that, I'm actually working with a former student on illustrating a story that I wrote, a 4-page story on being diabetic and Latina, and what that has kind of meant for me. And the person I'm working with is a fantastic artist, but brand new to illustrating comics. So it's a really cool collaboration where we're kind of learning from each other on how to build this story. And I'm hoping that this story will be the beginning of either a graphic novel or a series of floppies about being diabetic and Latinx, which, you know, where are these stories? And there's so many of us. There's so many Latinx diabetics, and yet we have no stories, right? And then I'm also working on, I'm editing a couple of graphic novel projects, which I'm super excited about. Those should be coming out, I believe, this year. And then what else? I think I'll just stop there. There are all these other sort of balls in the air, but that's you know,
now I've got all these incredibly creative, smart people in front of me. Let me ask you guys one title each. Like, what is a title, BIPOC title, comic book title that you just can't live without having experienced?
I'm not gonna stick to one. I'm gonna tell you right now, I'm violating that rule immediately. Monstrous by Marjorie Liu. Fantastic. Miles Morales. by the new issues by Salah Ahmed, really embracing the sort of like bicultural aspect of him. Spider-Man fighting against child traffickers, preying on the undocumented. Who doesn't want to read that all day, you know? And I'll say one last one that isn't BIPOC necessarily, but I think is really great in terms of gender, is Kill 6 Billion Demons, which has a rich cast of sort of genderqueer characters of multiple valences, and it's also just like a crazy action comic that's splicing all these different Japanese, Indian, indigenous mythologies into something that is a true gestalt. So those would be my three.
Enrique.
From the stuff I have been reading for my book, there is a milestone comic called Blood Syndicate, which I think is genius in terms of gender and race and class and everything. And it has Black Latinx and Indigenous and Asian. And so to me, I actually am teaching that with a lot of detail this in the spring. I also like from the corporate comics, Miss Marvel.
Yeah.
Miss Marvel, I think, is genius in terms of representation, which is interesting because the writer is a white woman that converted to Islam. So you know, it's interesting in terms of dynamics of the creator. And then the Puerto Rican comic that I have been publishing the most is Labor in Kenya, which only has published 2 issues, and I already have written 2 articles about it. So, so I don't know. I'll end up writing like 5 articles.
It's like, create faster. We have more things we need to write. Hurry up. So it takes years to create these, right? And then we do our work and we're like, where's the next one? Because we read it in 10 minutes.
Yeah.
But Enrique told Miss Marvel, I'm teaching that this semester. Absolutely love it. And it's a great superhero gateway, so we can talk about superhero comics and BIPOC characters, but then move on to other things. So we sort of honor the superhero bit, and then I like to expand from there. 3 others: Day Tripper by the Brazilian brothers. Yeah, Moon and Ba, fan freaking tastic. Taught that a couple times. Days of the Dead, DAZE, Javier Hernandez. I've also taught that numerous times. My students go bananas over it. And then another one I'm teaching this semester again, Bitch Planet, which I think is just phenomenal.
Well, what can I say? I have had the honor to learn with these incredibly talented scholars, minds, creators. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay.